Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we are beginning our chapter on the Industrial Revolution, which by all accounts of human history is one of the fundamental turning points, on par with the Neolithic Revolution when humans began domesticating plants and animals as opposed to hunting and gathering. Before we get into the causes of the Industrial Revolution, though, there's a couple of things that I want to illustrate by way of putting a context around this. First, this is a deceptively simple graph of the relative share of global manufacturing. And what I need you to understand, if you look along the left here, 100% is the total amount of things that are manufactured in the world, of goods that are manufactured in 1750 almost exclusively by hand. And the way you read the graph, it's not the total amount so much as the width of each of the different colors. So, for example, if you go down here, the only Asian representative on this is Japan, which, if you look at how thick it is, in 1750, Japan is producing, what would you say, 3 or 4%, 4% maybe, of all of the world's manufactured goods. By 1900, though, that is smaller, and so it's maybe about 2%. On the other hand, look at the United States, which in 1750 doesn't exist. It's a colony, it's negligible. By 1800, it starts growing and it continues to grow. So the key to reading this is the thicker the line, the greater the percentage of global manufacturing output. What I want you to understand about this, though, is two things. First, look at the United Kingdom. And in a moment, we're going to get into what exactly is the difference between England and Britain and the United Kingdom. But what I want you to notice is it continues to grow until 1750, and then it really starts to take off. And you'll notice that, like, by 1880, this is where their line is at its thickest. But if you notice, after 1880, the relative width of that line starts to shrink. That means that the United Kingdom is starting to decrease slightly in terms of its percentage of global manufacturing output. Finally, the biggest thing about this I want you to understand is what's not here. So let's take Japan out of this equation, okay? If we have the colony in North America, these are European states, and they're roughly at about 20% of the global manufacturing output. And Japan's about 4%. But let's say it's about 20% of the global manufacturing output is coming from Europe, okay, in 1750. The question is, then who is producing the other 80% of global manufactured goods? And the answer is almost all of that 80% is coming from India and China. And this is what is astonishing. Look by 1900, okay? And you've got the United States, which is in many ways a kind of a continuation of Western Europe. But the United States and Europe is about 80% in 1900. Where's the other 20% coming from? China and India. And this is the first thing I want you to get about this. This is an astonishing development. Almost 80% of the world's manufactured goods in 1750 come from India and China. How do we know that? Because it's always been the case that India and China are producing the manufactured goods that the rest of the world wants. It had been that way literally for millennia. And yet, in the span of just 150 years, what is frequently referred to as the long 19th century, because it's clearly more than 100 years, the China and India is completely displaced in terms of global manufacturing. That is how dramatic a change the Industrial Revolution is. The second thing I want to make clear before we begin is the difference between England, Britain, and the United Kingdom. Now, this what you see on this map, there are two main islands, one here and one here. Okay? England is one part of this large island. This island is called Britain. Okay? In 1066, all the kings of England were united under one crown, creating a kind of feudal monarchy. But then in 1542, they incorporated Wales, which again is part of Britain. So now it's starting to move until officially in 1707, Scotland is incorporated as well. All of this island is under one crown, one king, one ruler. That is Great Britain. So Great Britain is England plus Wales plus Scotland. Now in 1801, they also incorporate this whole island of Ireland. That becomes then the United Kingdom. These two islands, Britain and Ireland, are united as one kingdom. Now, in the 20th century, the majority of the island of Ireland will break away from the United Kingdom, but the northern part, what's now known as Northern Ireland, will continue. So as we go through the rest of today, we're going to talk about Britain, and in fact, for most of the rest of this unit. So again, Britain is what we're talking about is this island right here. England and Wales and Scotland all united. So let's get into the big thing that I want to focus on today, which is this question: why did the Industrial Revolution begin in Great Britain? Let's be honest, it's a relatively tiny island nation. How in the heck did this dramatic thing in world history begin there? And I'm going to give you 5 contributing factors, 5 causes that could also explain why it actually began in Great Britain. And I'm kind of going in opposite order here. I'll explain what I mean. One reason is because of the government support of capitalism. Now, I'm not going to talk more about this today, but later on in the week we'll get into the ideology of capitalism and its roots in the Enlightenment philosophies that, as we have seen, have affected all of the political revolutions throughout the Atlantic world. But the basic idea right now is that that belief, that ideology that guides the government is creating an infrastructure that allows the Industrial Revolution to happen. For example, England and then Britain is kind of unique because they have a central banking system. In other words, they are all part of one banking system, and a big part of that system involves extending credit. And that credit is going to be needed in order to purchase the machines, the new inventions, and build the factories that are going to spark the Industrial Revolution. Another issue, though, is as we have seen, their legal system is very interested in protecting private property. This is conceived as one of the natural rights, according to the Enlightenment philosophers in England at the time. And so the notion that you have private property protected by a legal system is again going to fuel that economic growth. And finally, a policy that is passed through Parliament called the Enclosure Acts has several different sort of avenues in terms of creating the conditions for the Industrial Revolutions. But one of them right now, and I'll get into what exactly the Enclosure Acts are in a moment, but one of them is the Enclosure Acts take what had been communal land that anybody could use and turns it into private property. And a consequence of that is that many of the peasants who had been using this communal land to farm enough to feed their families are now not allowed to use that land because it's private, and consequently they are moving to cities looking for work. And so there's this dramatic expansion of people looking to work in anything, regardless of what it is, because the alternative is they're going to starve. That creates a labor surplus, which then again fuels industrialization. Now, a second cause is Britain's huge advantages in global trade. You might remember that in the uh, late agrarian, early modern period, England, which was England at the time, was actually benefiting from the mercantilist system that all the Europeans were using because they were focused more on their own manufactured goods. That's going to provide a sort of prerequisite for industrial growth. They were also using their colonies as markets to help develop those early industries. And you might also remember too that they were kind of unique, at least compared to Spain, which was getting all that silver, insofar as they were using joint stock companies, these private corporations that were doing their bidding, so to speak, particularly in Asia. And again, that's going to sort of lay the groundwork for the industrial revolution within Britain. Part of those companies, though, in South Asia is giving them access to the cotton textiles from India, which for most of human history, like cotton fabric used to make clothes came from India. And so they have direct access not just to the production of it, but also to the selling of it. They're into this global market in a way that is kind of unique because of their joint stock companies and their role that they're playing in South Asia. Now, the last three causes are the ones I'm going to focus on for the remainder of this presentation, and they are in sort of reverse order. As I mentioned before, because England in the last time period is focused on its manufacturing, they had developed what's known as cottage industries. And those cottage industries lay the foundation for manufacturing in factories. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Agricultural and population growth is another key component to this. And again, I'll go into this in much more detail. But as we'll see, there's something kind of unusual going on in Britain during this time period with agricultural production compared to other parts of Europe. And then finally, or in my case, initially, there are certain geographical benefits in Britain that the rest of Europe and indeed most of the world did not share. So these last three are the ones I'm going to focus on for the remainder of the presentation, and I'm sort of going backwards here. So let's start with the favorable natural resources. And the irony here is that the industrial revolution in many ways is sort of it's kick-started by a crisis, and that crisis is deforestation. Necessity is the mother of invention, it's frequently said, and in many ways you could argue that's what happened in the island of Britain. Why? Because they had chopped down all the trees. Why did they chop down all of their trees? Well, first of all, they needed the lumber, the boards coming from the timber for all of their buildings. They used the wood for their heating and their cooking. But they also used charcoal to produce iron. Now, here's what I need you to understand about charcoal. Charcoal does not come from coal. It actually comes from wood. And the way you produce charcoal is you burn the wood in a really low oxygen environment. You kind of starve the fire as much as you can without putting it out of oxygen. And what that does is it burns off all of the other impurities in the wood. And what you're left with, like if you imagine, charcoal briquettes from your barbecue in the backyard, you're left with this dark black substance that is super concentrated carbon. Everything else gets burned off. That charcoal produces heat far greater than if you just burn regular wood. And to make iron, to melt iron ore, you need a flame hotter than just regular old wood could produce. So all of these factors then contribute to the fact that the island of Britain is literally running out of trees. Fortunately, though, they have a solution in coal. In the island of Britain, there is a great deal of coal, which initially was right underneath the surface of the soil. And in fact, in many places in Britain, farmers who would be working, in the fields producing food in the warmer months, in the colder months, they would go and sort of chop out this coal because it was just right there at the surface. You didn't even have to really mine for it. You just kind of had to dig a little bit below the soil. So most of the coal operations before the Industrial Revolutions were just farmers who were looking for some sort of work in the season when they couldn't be planting. But again, there's an awful lot of it in the island of Britain compared to other areas in the world. But the big turning point in 1712 is Thomas Newcomen comes up with a steam pump that its original intention was to pump the water out of the mines. Once the coal at the surface is gone, you got to dig deeper to get there. Well, you dig deeper and you're eventually going to hit a water table and it's going to just flood and then you can't dig out any more coal. The steam pump allows that water to get pumped out, which allows the miners to dig deeper to get more coal out. Now, a final aspect of this has to do with iron, because like coal, Britain is unique because there's a great deal of iron ore. Again, that's the iron that's sort of trapped in rocks. They have an awful lot of it compared to other parts of the world. But of course, the trick is you got to get it out. Well, the way they got it out used to be using charcoal, and it would create something called pig iron. Pig iron is like raw iron, if you want to think of it that way. It's very, very brittle. You need to work it a great deal to get anything useful out of it. It's so brittle that it would just break. If you tried to just use pig iron to make a tool, for example, it would break the first time you used it. But the thing that was good about it was that you could create a whole bunch of it, and then it could be given to blacksmiths, and they would then, by a process of melting it and hammering it and dousing it in water and repeating that process over and over, they could turn it into something that was useful. However, later on, there is an invention called Coke. Now, Coke does not mean Coca-Cola, nor does it mean cocaine in this context. Coke is basically charcoal from coal. Somebody figures out that if you take coal and you burn it in a low oxygen environment, the way that wood was transformed into charcoal, coal could be transformed into coke, and coke burns way hotter than coal does. And so that allows a new process for making iron called potting and stamping. So it produces a way that it's cheaper and it's better quality iron, and you can make a whole lot more of it. All of these, those are benefits of the geographical context in the island of Britain, which make it kind of unique. In this table, what you see, though, is the extent to which coal production becomes a driving factor in British society in the Industrial Revolution. The images at the bottom, if you look on the left, like getting the coal out of these mines before the invention of machines is ridiculously hard, and you got to fit into those tight spots. And so frequently, whereas it had been the case that farmers in the off season would be your coal miners, increasingly they become children. That'll turn into a labor issue we'll talk about more later on. Okay, so next let's talk about agricultural developments, because again, there's something unique about the island of Britain in this regard compared to other places. The first of these has to do with the Enclosure Acts, which I mentioned previously. They were an act of parliament that turned communal land into private land. And one of the effects, as I mentioned, was that creates a labor surplus because peasants are now moving off of farms and looking for work. But it's kind of uh, the opposite of what you would think happened, though, is it actually did increase the productivity on the land that was used. Why? Well, because who is buying up all of that land that is now private? It's mostly people who have enough money to not just purchase the land, but they can also afford the new equipment that is being developed. So what we're seeing here is a kind of development of a new agricultural science that is a direct reflection of the scientific revolution that in fact happened in the previous early modern late agrarian era. We also start to see more iron tools that are better quality used for actually farming that. But one in particular tool that is invented is the seed drill, invented by a guy named Jethro Tull. And the thing about the seed drill was it's human powered. It's not a machine the way we think of a machine. But it is a machine, and it injects the seeds deep into the soil. And the effect of that is if you plant the same amount of seed, a greater proportion of it will actually lead to food. This is something called a yield ratio. And if you look at this particular chart on the left, the yield ratios up here, that's how much of the seed that you plant actually produces food. And then you've got the dates down here. Now, the blue line right here is Britain. And what you will notice is beginning in 1700, the yield ratio, the amount of food produced, just in farming the exact same amount of space with the exact same number of seeds, the food production skyrockets. I want to point out one thing really quickly about this. This line right here is France. And if you notice, right around the time of the French Revolution is when the food production starts going crazy. And you might remember one of the short-term causes of the French Revolution was that there simply wasn't enough food to feed everybody. So the bottom line is what's happening in Britain is they're able to produce more food in the same amount of land with the same amount of seeds. That leads to a food surplus, which lowers the prices of food. That in turn is going to fuel remarkable population growth. Compared to other parts of Europe, the population growth just blows up after 1750 in the island of Britain. That also, in addition to the fact that you've got displaced peasants, is going to provide a surplus of laborers to work in these new factories. Finally, then, let's talk about how do we get to these factories? Well, the basis is the existing way that they manufactured their goods. And this was using something called cottage industries. Now, a cottage is like a small little house, right? And as the name Cottage Industries implies, most of the manufactured goods before the Industrial Revolution were produced in people's homes. How did that system work? Well, it worked by using something called the putting out system. You put out manufactured goods. Here's how it works. First of all, you would have merchants who were traveling from village to village, maybe from fair to fair within different cities, selling their goods. But one of the things they were also doing was selling to certain families raw materials. So let's say, for example, cotton. I'm a merchant and I've got a whole bunch of raw cotton. And I might sell to a particular household the cotton. And then that family, usually the mother and the daughters, would then take that cotton and turn it into thread using a spinning machine. Then as I go, make my rounds and I'm going around to different communities, eventually I'm going to come back and the cotton, raw cotton that I sold to this family has now been transformed into thread. So now I'm going to buy that thread back, obviously at a marked up price, because the person that turned the cotton into thread is going to get a profit off it. But then I'm going to buy that thread. And then I'm going to take that thread to another house and I'm going to sell the thread to somebody who could weave it to make cloth. And then when I return there, I'm going to buy the cloth. And then I might take the cloth to another family who can turn it into, I don't know, suits, and then buy the suits back. This is the putting out system. And it primarily works with textiles, but it also worked with metallurgy. So I might sell some pig iron to a family where they have a workshop and they could then work that into what's known as wrought iron, which you could make tools out of. And then I'll come back and buy that. And then I'll take it to somebody else who then turns the wrought iron into a tool. And then when I come back to them, I buy the tools and then I sell the tools to somebody else. So that's the putting out system that is fueling the cottage industries that exist before the Industrial Revolution. As I mentioned, two of those key cottage industries were metallurgy and textiles. Pig iron, as I mentioned, it could be worked and then turned into a kind of iron that you could turn into tools. Cotton became thread. The thread would then become cloth. A key invention here is something known as the flying shuttle, which it's a machine, but it's a people-powered machine early on in 1733 that made it easier to actually weave the threads into cloth. But again, kind of like what happens with the situation with deforestation, necessity is the mother of invention. And there was a constant shortage of thread, and that sparked a whole bunch of technological innovations. Initially, to sort of like make the cottage industries better, but then it eventually gets so efficient that it turns into factory production. Earliest among these, as I mentioned, was the spinning jenny, which if you take a look at this, you'll see the wheel up there that is turned by hand. It's human powered machinery. But the point is, whereas instead the old spinning wheel would produce uh, one batch of thread, if you look here, you can see that it's producing dozens of them at the same time. So it's human powered, but it's increasing the amount of thread that you can use. Then we get the water frame, which is a machine powered by water that does the same thing. It creates thread, but the key here is it's not producing as much as the spinning jenny, but it's doing it without human power. Finally, then we get the spinning mule, which combines the efficiency of the spinning jenny with the power from water in the water frame. The spinning mule then is where we really start to get the first factories. Finally, then, we get the power loom. Now, the power loom is used to weave all those threads into fabric, into a textile. But the key part to this invention was instead of using water power, it's using power from steam. And we'll talk more about this later on, but steam, which was originally invented to create a pump to get water out of coal mines, which we think of it as Watt's invention. What Watt did is he simply took the steam pump that Newcomen invented and then transforms it so that it can run machines. So what we end up getting then is the earliest factories. Now, a couple of things I want you to notice about this is, first of all, almost all of those women are working there to produce the thread. They're almost all women. Why? Well, because you could pay a woman half as much as a man to do any particular job. And of course, capitalists looking to always maximize their profits, that's a good deal. But you'll also see in the left here this woman who's tying up her hair. Because one of the most horrible things that happened in these early factories, if your hair got stuck in any of this machinery, it would literally weave your head into the thread. Like it's pulling you in and you're going to die. Later on, then we get factories that look like this. This is a system of power looms. And again, what you notice here is all of these belts. Here's the weaving that's producing the cloth. Here's where all the threads are. But again, look at how horrible that is. Like you get stuck in any of that machinery, you're losing a limb, you're losing your head, you're losing your life. It's really, really rough work. So here's the bottom line then. You've got the slides that you've hopefully annotated. You've got a focus series of focus questions. Identify and describe the 5 contributing factors. 3 of them I went into detail. 2 of them I just sort of glanced over real quickly. That will be your focus questions. Use your notes for that. But then there's also another one that is an opinion question. Of those 5 causes, those 5 factors that contribute to the Industrial Revolution beginning in Great Britain, I want you to rank them in order of importance in your opinion. I want to repeat, there's no right or wrong answer on these. I'm just generally curious, which of those 5 factors do you think was the most important in contributing to the Industrial Revolution, and the second most important, third, fourth, and fifth? Again, it's an opinion question, but do please give it some thought. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys in class.